Thanks for listening and welcome to Guardians of the Directory, your go-to podcast for exploring the hidden layers of directory services, cybersecurity, and everything in between. I'm your host, Craig Birch, identity security enthusiast and principal security engineer, focused on identity with over 20 plus years of industry experience architecting and securing Microsoft identity solutions. Well, enough about me. Let's focus on today's discussion. So I'm glad that Sander has joined me today. One of the things that we were talking about in a previous webinar was stop the chaos and really how hybrid Active Directory has become very complex in the organization. And I even went as far as saying to Sander in a couple LinkedIn posts is it's not just complex, it's really broken. So today I'm joined by Sander. So Sander, can you actually introduce yourself to the audience?
Yes, I've been an IT pro for the last 25 years. I've worked at a company, was part of a company. I now have my own company for the past 2 years, and I typically do identity jobs at my customers. I'm a 17-year MVP. I used to be a Veeam Vanguard. I used to be a VMware V expert when we were all using VMware. That kind of age. And I wrote both editions of the Active Directory Administration Cookbook, and I run a little website called directories.com where I help people with their Active Directory, but also hybrid identity challenges.
Awesome. So obviously you have a little bit of expertise in this area. You're helping organizations become better in this area. So this is something you're living on a daily basis, just not talking about it.
Experiencing nightmares on a nightly basis. Yes.
Exactly. So really, hybrid AD is often described as messy. But when we were talking, we said it's really broken. What do you see as the core identity dysfunction of most orgs today?
So Microsoft has been trying new names for what we call hybrid AD in this webinar. Hybrid identity was the one that they settled on. But things like one identity or one AD has also been something that Microsoft has touted. And it is far from that. It is two identities that Microsoft presents as one, but are that. And actually, you could even say that it's more than those two identities. The two identities that Microsoft typically talks about, the one in Active Directory, the one in Entra ID, or was previously Azure Active Directory. But those are the two main stores where you can use your account. But I think almost everybody now uses Entra Connect Sync because that's the tool that Microsoft supports to build that hybrid AD. In its metaverse, there's a person object too. So you could say it's three objects. The Entra Connect Sync database has that metaverse. It also has the flat representations of Active Directory and Entra ID. There's all kinds of stuff where your account information, your object, your attributes are mangled, are managed, are processed. And it's not as simple as Microsoft tells it because all of these components can break pretty easily.
So you're
Active Directory you wouldn't believe the amount of stuff that people throw at Active Directory, and Active Directory just keeps running. But the other components, they're not that mature.
So you're talking about Active Directory. You mentioned Entra ID Connect and Entra ID, formerly known as Azure AD. And so for those that may not understand the architecture, so we're talking about an on-prem Active Directory environment and then environment.
Do we, Craig? Do you still think that most Active Directories are on premises?
Well,
or they're running in AWS and on Azure. And
you bring a good point. So what we're talking about is running a Active Directory domain controller infrastructure in a data center, whether it's in your core data center, your cloud data center as infrastructure as service, and then really having this, I'll call it identity bridge called Entra ID Connect. So it's a server that's running some backend software and some SQL to basically then use that as a repository, and then it syncs those identities from your on-prem Active Directory to Entra ID. So that's what Sander's talking about. And there is definitely some challenges in regards to just that architecture as a whole. And now Microsoft have, even put out a new architecture around hybrid identities. And one of the big challenges, if we think about that architecture, is having those super elevated rights, it being on a Windows server. We have two control planes to defend, both on-prem, and when I say on-prem, I'm talking about the original Active Directory, as well as, the cloud Entra ID. So the attack surfaces definitely have grown from that. But it's not just the attack surface. You just added a ton of complexity from an operations and management perspective as well, because there's not a single interface, as we talked about earlier, to kind of manage those as a whole. It's a big challenge. So that's definitely interesting.
And some of the things you can only do through PowerShell, for instance.
Correct.
Yeah, or through code. Yep. And that makes it hard because on the Active Directory side, we have had PowerShell. Well, I think reliable PowerShell since Windows Server 2012 for Active Directory. With Entra ID, we've had, we had the MS Online module, we had the Azure AD module, the Azure AD Preview module. We even had a version 1 of the Graph API PowerShell module, or PowerShell SDK it was. We're now, I guess, at version 2 of the PowerShell SDK for Entra or for the Graph API. Yeah, we might see a version 3, but every time we had some breaking changes, which makes it hard to keep telling people, you know what, if you're going to do things 3 times, do it in PowerShell. Well, with Entra ID, probably if you have to do it 7 times, then you can actually be more productive because you have to lifecycle your PowerShell scripts now.
That is an interesting point, especially with, the most recent version of Graph API and deprecating SOL PowerShell commands that, we all grew up with. So
Yep.
I'm kind of dating myself here when I say that, but it is true. So one of the things we talked about is from an admin perspective, what do they get stuck going repeatedly in the organizations that are dealing with hybrid environments? What are some of the big challenges you see there?
So one of the big challenges, of course, is backup and replication. So backup of domain controllers, backup of ADFS servers, backup of your Entra Connect servers, provisioning agents. Some agents cannot live together on the same Windows Server box. When you go deeper into hybrid AD with Entra password protection, Entra provisioning agent, Entra proxy agent, it has a new name now too, because we now have internet access. We no longer have Azure AD proxy. That's all into a new product. But if you go deeper, you'll see that it's all those little pieces that you have to continually look at, manage, and sometimes run PowerShell on.
So you think it's just the overarching architecture that's causing this problem from the admins, or there are other pieces behind that that's causing some of these challenges?
Well, the big challenge, of course, is that within hybrid AD today, the source of authority for user accounts is still Active Directory. And for a lot of organizations, they've started with Entra, or they started with Azure Active Directory, and now they have this weird app or servers or system that suddenly requires something like NTLM, and they have to do something with domain controllers on-prem, for instance, because it's for factory or whatever, and they don't want to do Entra domain services for that. And so it's all clunky, it's all meshed together, and you have to look at different spots to get the information that you need. If someone's self-service password reset in Entra doesn't work, then it's like 7, 8 components that you need to check to make sure that you know where in that flow towards your domain controllers something went wrong, which is exactly what Entra will tell you. Something went wrong. Well, that's not that useful from a user perspective. It's calling service desk, and what happened? Well, something went wrong.
So one of the things we also talked about as part of that webinar is the hidden costs, right, of managing this complex environment. You want to shed some insight on some of the things that we discussed in regards to operational, overhead, administrative overhead, those types of things, as well as from the CISO's perspective even?
Yeah, so whenever an admin needs to switch from a server or switch to another dashboard, that's the word that Microsoft uses, and we've seen loads and loads of dashboards sprawl over the years. Even Entra has his own portal now. It used to be part of the Azure portal, but no, Entra now has his own admin center. So whenever you need to switch from one center to another, whenever you have to switch from one server to another server, it's those sign-ins, it's those handoffs, it's handoffs between teams, sometimes even. It just adds to the overall through time to get things fixed.
Of jumping through all these other systems?
Yeah, just for starters, yes. And then there's the things you can only do on PowerShell. So you need to know what you're doing, and you need to know that if you run it and you get a certain error, it's because you didn't elevate your prompt. And it's all those things that make it hard to manage.
So would you feel like, obviously, if you started out with, I'll call it traditional Active Directory, not going to call it on-prem anymore, traditional Active Directory.
Classic Active Directory, that's
Classic
what
Active Directory.
365 now calls it. Yeah, classic.
There was a certain level of upskilling, right? When I say upskilling, you had to learn, Entra, you had to learn this new architecture on how to do the identity bridge. So the identity bridge between there, and then obviously now we have, these I'll call traditional accounts that are coming from Active Directory, but then we also have a mixture of what we call cloud only assets as well. That has really changed the landscape, how we have to manage these, as well as with traditional Active Directory. Going back to traditional Active Directory, we were primarily working with accounts that were our own business accounts.
Yes, not
But
guests.
with Entra ID, we've really flipped that, right? Because now we have guest accounts, we have B2B accounts, and we also have a lot of non-human identities. But it's really become a much more complex ecosystem than what we'll call traditional Active Directory.
Yes.
In the sense of that.
Well, yeah. Classic Active Directory with just Windows user accounts, Windows devices, group policies. But yeah, Classic AD, as admins have been taught to manage since 2000. And it only changed. And Classic Active Directory only changes like every 3 years, right? You get, if you're lucky, you get a new functional level for the first, a new functional domain level. You get some new features that you can solve challenges with if you have them. Some of the organizations that I work with have tons of domain controllers. Yeah, there's definite new features in Windows Server 2025 that help them. But typically every 3 years. In Entra, there's like changes like 3 times a day. And I'm not talking about like just the spell check error things that they're doing and capitalization on title screens and things like that. No, there's definite new functions every month. And some of them, there's heavy weeks and there's slow weeks.
Windows Server 2025 and the enhancements for Active Directory, do you see organizations quickly moving to Server 2025 to upgrade their Active Directory from your client perspective?
No, I've actually, and we've now seen the August cumulative updates for Windows Server 2025. And one of the big problems with Active Directory on Windows Server 2025, new delegated managed service account, DMSA, that problem has been addressed in the August cumulative updates. So yeah, I feel safer now to migrate some of my customers over, because if you have full control over certain items or full control over an organizational unit in Classic AD, then you can use that to elevate all the way up to domain admin if you wanted to. Successor, yes, that has been addressed.
Akamai had, I think, was one of the researchers from Akamai had.
Yeah, Yuval Gordon disclosed that to Microsoft, and at first it wasn't a problem, but hey, we now do have some updates to address it. Yep.
Yeah, I saw that, and that's obviously working where I work. We put out some detection around bad successor, but now it's patched. So we'll see how that really plays out. I haven't gone in and tested.
We've seen the first patch.
There's more on that. We'll obviously around that particular vulnerability has been put out. So, but at least we've seen the initial patch. So that was one of the main reasons you believe, once that was discovered, that organizations kind of said, we're going to pump the brakes and we're not going to move forward until.
Yes. Yeah, and the other thing is that if you really want to take advantage of everything that's new in Active Directory in Windows Server 2025, the new scalability options, you actually have to transition to new domain controllers, to fresh new Windows Server 2025 domain controllers. You can't do in-place upgrades.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's another thing that I see holding some customers off on upgrading.
Well, as I mentioned, you're working with clients on a regular basis. Can you describe some of the real-world client pain that you've been able to fix around some of these hybrid concerns?
Well, one of the things, for instance, that I found out recently with an organization that had multiple ADFS installations, not all of them managed, not all of them known to central IT, and in the Entra interface, it will tell you if a domain is federated, the DNS domain name is federated, but not to what ADFS infrastructure. So we had to figure that out in the new Graph SDK, how to get that information surfaced so that we could work with that, and we could actually select all the DNS domain names that belong to a certain ADFS infrastructure, and then switch them over to managed authentication.
So that was more around the federation piece.
Yeah, well, if you look at the bridge between
Right.
Classic AD and Entra ID, of course, Entra Connect Sync is there, but there's a couple of ways that organizations can handle authentication from their devices and from unknown devices towards Entra. And you can have federation with ADFS, but ADFS, or you can have password hash synchronization or pass-through authentication if you want to authenticate down that bridge.
So for ADFS, so that's obviously Active Directory Federation Services is what we're talking about. I believe it's a dying architecture. Now, I know a lot of organizations still have ADFS, so I'll say it that way. But because of native federation services in Entra ID, do you see? So maybe I mean, you're living this more than I am, right? I'm not in customer environments anymore. So let me ask that question. So are you still seeing a large footprint of Active Directory Federation servers in organizations, or are they moving towards native federation services in Entra ID?
Yeah, so what I see and what I typically help organizations with is move off of ADFS, but there are a couple of scenarios where organizations still need ADFS. And there's mainly two, because Microsoft kind of fumbled up the third-party MFA integration. There was a model that organizations or vendors, MFA vendors, could onboard to, and then Microsoft stopped that and said, no, we're working on something great new, and then everything stopped for 3 years. There's now a new cool kid on the block, new way to do your MFA, and Dirk Mollema, a fellow Dutchman, he made a really nice MFA integration that tells Entra that you did MFA, but you didn't have to do MFA. So yeah, that's a neat little thing to demo sometimes. But if organizations have deployed MFA, for instance, in typical verticals would be healthcare, with no offense, but with elder people, once you have them on one version of MFA or have them accustomed to one MFA, you typically don't want to get them onto another MFA method. Ultimately, they will for some phishing-resistant MFA methods in the next years, but now they can, with ADFS, they can still use that MFA plugin and keep using that towards Entra sign-ins as well, which is one. And the second scenario is just one word, shibboleth. And shibboleth is something that we see in education a lot. And there's still a Microsoft page that tells you that if you want to do shibboleth apps with Entra, you have to put ADFS in between.
And I did not know that. So we talked about like what's broken, and you talked about some of the pains. Primarily you've been talking about federation services and the hybrid,
I'm sorry, people. Yeah. I was only, just boring topics. I'm sorry.
No,
Yep.
It's all good. Everybody likes to know a little bit more around what's going on in real world. So I appreciate that insight. So, but let's talk about what you see that's working in organizations. Are there some things that organizations are doing right around hybrid management, and what are those things particularly?
So I'm always, I wouldn't say surprised, but two of the ADFS migration projects that I've run in the last year were organizations where I deployed ADFS in 2016, 2017 on Windows Server 2016, already connect installations on Windows Server 2016. And these boxes have been running for 8 years without a lot of problems. But Windows Server 2016 support is ending, not this October, but only in January of 2027, luckily. But these organizations wanted to move to newer version of, or the newer clunky hybrid AD. So yeah, it's switching over from ADFS to managed authentication if we can. So from ADFS to PHS mostly. It's getting all the relying party trusts that are on ADFS towards Entra ID, and it is putting new Windows Server 2025 installations there with the latest version of Entra Connect Sync. And that way, Windows Server 2025 will be supported for the next 9 years. That way, I hope that they don't have to look at the bridge that much.
So When outside the bridge and Federation services, are there things that organizations are doing right in regards to management and really onboarding? So think about identity and access management or
Mhm.
identity governance and administration
Yes.
types of services. Because you've mentioned you're doing some of those projects as well. What are you seeing? I guess the good, the bad, the ugly, but also what is working for organizations so that they know what a normal, like an optimal model might look like.
Yes.
Can you share some of that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course. But I don't really have to dive that deep because Gartner just released their IAM Magic Quadrant, and you can clearly see SailPoint, Savient as leaders, and Microsoft as a challenger. And that's how organizations that I talk to typically see the Entra ID governance features that are now in Entra. Some of these features, like access reviews and access packages, were part of Entra ID Premium P2 licenses before, but they're now all in the Entra ID governance package and in Entra Suite. So now if you really want to do IAM with Entra ID, you'll really have to get those licenses on top of the monthly licenses that you already pay for your users, for your workload identities, for Intune for devices, all that stuff. But the Entra ID governance features are maturing fast, and they've done a great. I think they've done a great job with coming up with the next generation of FIM or MIM, Microsoft Identity Manager. And I think they've created a good successor, not a bad successor, but a good successor to FIM or MIM, Microsoft Identity Manager, Forefront Identity Manager, that a lot of organizations used to do some of their IAM processing. And it is about processes. It is about onboarding, offboarding. It is about movers besides those joiners and leavers. It is about attestations and reporting and all that stuff that Microsoft is building and building and building as building blocks in Entra ID governance.
So you mentioned a couple players there, and well, not you, but
Mhm.
Gartner, and they all kind of do similar things. Let's be
Yes.
honest. They're very connector driven. A lot
Yes.
of these solutions are connector driven, and I believe, from what I've read, and you can keep me honest because I haven't done a lot of deep research here, but I believe Microsoft Entra Governance has a lot of connector capability as well. In
Yes.
regards to that's kind of like their stance. They went down with connectors. So, and you mentioned, FIM, MIM, right? Identity management in Microsoft has been around for years. Let's be honest. It's been rebranded. Do you feel like this is just a rebrand of their existing platform, or did we really see a big shift with identity governance or Entra governance?
Well, I guess it depends on how deep you want to look at it. So if we're looking at Entra Connect Sync, which also uses the same engine as FIM and MIM and
Right.
ILM and IAFM and everything before that, all the way back to VIA, it is a time-based engine. So it runs on a schedule, and the schedules are getting shorter because FIM and MIM typically in organizations, they only run daily. Entra Connect Sync every 30 minutes, Entra Connect Cloud Sync every 2 minutes, but it's still schedule based. It's not hooked based. It's not event driven. So how far did Microsoft come? I guess they looked at it, but it just wasn't feasible to make it event driven.
So when you say event driven, there are solutions out there that are event driven. So
Absolutely.
basically,
Yep.
we see the change, we push the change immediately into that environment because now it requires that person to have a new identity profile or a new identity access. So obviously provisioning, you mentioned, right, onboarding, right? Offboarding, moving between environments, core identity management practices. You're seeing a lot of organizations do that, right? Is what you're, or
Yes, I guess. It all depends on what you feel is right. So my definition of right is getting stuff done. I'll gladly admit that I'm a consultant, and I guess that what I just said confirms that. But with Entra ID governance, you can actually start really small. It's the building blocks that are there. You pick the building block, you configure it with a very small scope. You can test it, you can let it grow, and then one day it encompasses your entire organization. You can't do that with SailPoint or Savient or whatever, especially not if you're migrating over from one IAM solution to another one. And there's a couple of them that are going the way of the dinosaurs. SAP IDM, for instance, is one of them that is really going away fast these days that I've seen a lot of projects on too, but you can't do it in a real fix it kind of start small way. And Entra ID governance does that.
Allows you to baby step it in.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that Microsoft feels that is their sweet spot with Entra ID governance. It's just that it only kind of works if you already have the Entra suite in terms of licensing. Because if you want to do anything with access reviews for all the people, you would need to get those licenses.
So when you're talking about Entra governance, is it primarily just the traditional IDM activities, or are we talking now advanced management, hybrid management as well through a single interface? Once I provision these identities, can I manage these identities from a single platform using Entra governance? Or do I still have to go through all the different admin consoles, managing traditional Active Directory, because we're talking hybrid here, so managing traditional Active Directory, or have they gave a single interface to kind of address that?
So the entire promise of a single interface is not there, and not yet, at least, because some of the things in terms of Active Directory objects can only be done through the old MMCs. But with SCIM connectors and the Entra provisioning agent to build that bridge back to on-premises, where most of the times you can use the existing ECMA 2 connectors from the FIM and MIM age, can do a lot. And I guess it depends on how far you're automating stuff, how far you can get. But in most organizations, I think you will always need to accommodate for a certain level of flexibility in the organization, like the movers that will mess that up. I don't think you can go 100% with IAM.
Do I still have to delegate standing privileges to those environments for my admins? So
yes.
So I would have delegated admin rights inside of Active Directory, or I'd have to use
roles
to get signed. Okay. So no single way of kind of managing that. And that was one of the biggest challenges, right? A lot of organizations, they put these permissions in and they just grow over time. No one's really watching them. We talked about this at length. So that hasn't changed. That's still going to be a challenge. You said it initially. So it doesn't, I don't know if it's on the roadmap. We don't know what the roadmap fully looks like, so we won't go down that path. But it sounds like in the current state, even with Entra governance, you're saying hybrid identity management might be a little bit better, but you're saying that it is still broken.
Yes. So for the actual data flow itself, you can use a service principal or an enterprise application in the GUI. But to manage it, you typically need a hybrid identity admin. And that's a long list of API permissions.
But again, I would still have to jump between different interfaces to really do the full management. And if I want to give like password reset or group management, etc., in there. So speaking of groups, and does Entra governance allow you to do anything with dynamic group membership for traditional Active Directory, or is it only if the groups exist in Entra?
No, that's actually one of the newer features in Entra Connect Sync since version 2.5.3, I guess, is that you can now have the source of authority for groups in Entra.
The source of authority to do hybrid group management.
Yeah, and that means that you can author them from the Entra portal, and then they flow into Active Directory.
We've talked about management, and we talked about this hybrid architecture as well. What about security of these environments? Because the delegation piece and the high elevated privileges, obviously that becomes an expanded attack surface for those organizations. What are you seeing that organizations are doing differently to address that risk?
So what we're seeing in the Microsoft ecosystem, so for Entra Connect Sync, but also recently for the Exchange Hybrid organization, is that Microsoft is relying more and more on applications instead of service accounts. So we typically have a service account, the Entra Connector account in Entra Connect Sync. That's a username and password. And if you put MFA on it with conditional access, it breaks. Microsoft has now introduced application-based authentication for Entra Connect Sync based on certificates. Entra Connect Sync rolls a certificate automatically every 6 months, and the certificate that Entra Connect Sync gets is tied to the TPM chip if you have a TPM v2 or a vTPM v2 chip on that Windows server where Entra Connect Sync lives. So we're seeing all that stuff going towards Entra applications. So towards enterprise applications and app registrations. Now, luckily, everybody understands how Entra applications work. So it's not going to be a big problem at all. Yeah, even Microsoft themselves fumbled around twice because Midnight Blizzard not only got access to the production tenant from Microsoft through applications, but even access to their top brass email. So yeah, there's at least some people in allegedly Russia who know how to work Entra applications. So we're not all lost.
I mean, obviously, Entra, I mean, you mentioned it, right? There's a lot of challenges with managing Entra ID applications.
Yes.
The amount of permissions, application owner is, if you're referring back to Midnight Blizzard, as well as, application owner can change the authentication. So there's obviously big challenges there. Let's play a little game. So let's call it fix or fail. So I'm going to ask you something and you tell me if you either keep it or get rid of it. Build in 80 admin groups. Would you keep those or would you get rid of those? Standing admin groups inside of these environments.
Standing admin, well, obviously I would get rid of things like account operators and things like that. Print operators, server operators, because those are typically evil. But there are a couple of groups that set admin count to 1 that are actually useful, like domain admins, enterprise admins, and you cannot empty those out completely. You will still need a break glass account. Yeah, so that. And for the rest, there's solutions like CyberArk and things like that to get privileged access.
So we're talking traditional PAM solutions.
Yeah, but with break glass. And for the break glass, just keep it as simple as possible.
Doing role-based access or delegated administration at OU level. So think about AD delegation. Would you keep doing that or get rid of that?
I thought you were going to ask me something different. Active Directory trusts, keep or fail? Fail.
We can talk about that next.
Active Directory delegations, it's hard to get right. But if you get it right, then it is workable.
So you're saying you would keep going in and granting elevated rights, permanent elevated rights in traditional Active Directory?
Based on groups, yep. And then add people to groups. And those groups can now come from Entra if we really want to hurt ourselves.
Interesting. It's because I know that there's solutions out there that have totally gone away from that whole mentality.
Yes.
I'm just curious around that. Because obviously that's one of your biggest attack surfaces. Let's talk about another one. Using just SIM and we'll call it, the traditional auditing within Microsoft just for alerting and detection. Do you think that's enough? You're going to keep that or are you going to do something else with that?
No, what you'll see with traditional solutions that are typically on-prem, that's where on-prem is. They won't do anything with Entra and things like that. And it's all fun and games if you still have ADFS and you have your ADFS logs into an on-prem SIEM that gets that. The moment you go to managed authentication, you lose all the sign-in information if Entra is not supported. And there are a couple of SIEM vendors that still don't support Entra. So yeah, you have to go beyond network, of course, beyond endpoint. It's what we call ITDR right now.
All right, here's an easy one for you. Using custom scripts to do provisioning and automation of Active Directory and Entra ID user account management or user lifecycle management.
All right. Well,
so are you going to keep that or get rid of it?
I'm going to risk fight with the prominent Microsoft 365 MVP, but I would get rid of them. Yeah. If there's an IAM solution that does it, I won't be working with clunky PowerShell scripts toward Entra.
Definitely, there are some things you would definitely get rid of because we do believe that there's opportunity here and that the current process is broken. Sounds like, again, with Entra governance, as you mentioned, because you've been working on some projects around that you see some improvement there, but you're not going to go as far as saying that this is fixed by any means. So I guess...
I guess there is no...
you're right. There's not an easy fix. You can't patch. We actually even said that. You can't patch your existing solutions. You would need to rebuild and think differently from the ground up. And that was one of the things we discussed, because if you try to patch, you're just going to continue to have, these broken, disparate processes, security, gaps in your organization, as well as even, recovery is one of the challenges. So if you could snap your fingers and change one thing in how companies are running hybrid AD, what would be the biggest thing?
What would be the biggest thing? I think the biggest thing is in Active Directory replication.
Active Directory replication in regards to hybrid identities, though?
Because Entra Connect Sync determines a domain controller and it keeps talking to that domain controller. It's terribly sticky. And if that domain controller moves to another site, or it moves to a site where there's a 30-minute or a 15-minute replication schedule, you'll now see delays in your synchronization towards Entra. If there's admins working on an Active Directory site where they do all the changes, but the PDC is in another site and Entra Connect Sync is yet again in another site, it all adds delays. And with today's bandwidth, I'm not sure if we really need 50-minute or 30-minute synchronization schedules in Active Directory.
Well, there is the option to go to change-based notification replication. Are you seeing organizations adopt that, or are they
I'm doing it with most. I'm doing it with my customers. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious because obviously that is going to generate replicate.
It's going to get sure. Replication gets a little bit noisy, but there's in 15 minutes time, how many changes are actually bundled up? Every change still needs to go through the wire. So only undos, only oopsies from admins is what you gain typically, because you would still have that people in the Active Directory site get to a local domain controllers. You can still do Active Directory site specifics like printers and group policies if you really want to. And you can still set the bridgehead servers and things like that. So the only thing that you lose is that delay most of the times.
So that's the one thing you would change.
Yes. And that's the basic. And if it's interesting because when we do that, then other processes get noticed that they're delayed. So if you're an organization with less than 50,000 objects, you can then go from Entra Connect Sync to Entra Connect Cloud Sync. And that will get that 30-minute schedule back to 2 minutes.
So what I would there's probably two items that kind of come to mind for me. In a hybrid environment, we need to get to a single interface for management, because the more portals I have to jump through, different systems I have to jump through, that's me getting access to more of these systems. I have to go in and do management in these systems. And it's just complicates things. So the KISS role, right? Let's keep it simple. So in regard to that. And then the other thing is, if I could change one thing, I guess the biggest thing here would be, besides the portal, is elevated permissions, because of ransomware and how these attackers are going after identity platforms. If we could get to either just-in-time access, full just-in-time access, where the only thing I have is a one account, break glass account that is in my environment, that like the built-in administrator role, right? Or that account for traditional, or one global admin. Everybody else only gets access at the time that's needed and for the time that it's needed to be done.
Yeah.
And then that access goes away. Or if I can't do just in time, we move to a model where there's an account that is you're working through another portal system that is doing like proxy-based access through roles that doesn't require standing privileges. Those are the big ones I see as biggest challenges. I obviously put my security hat back on, right, from that aspect, but it also causes a ton of operational complexity having it set up this way.
Absolutely.
So,
yep.
The ones I would think would be top of mind for me. Any other closing remarks that you want to say in regards to what we talked about, or anything that you've learned, I guess, recently around this space?
Absolutely. Now, what we typically do, and we did it in this conversation too, is that we focused on the differences between classic AD and Entra. And because everybody keeps talking about those differences, some of the things that we need to do get bypassed, get forgotten by admins. So when we're talking about both Entra ID and Active Directory, they both need backups. And most organizations have backups for their Microsoft 365 data, their emails, their document libraries in SharePoint, their Teams chats. But it's really hard to restore those documents if you don't have the mailbox, because you don't have the user account, or because you don't have the enterprise application, or because you don't have the dynamic group expression, or because you don't have, well, there's a huge list of all the things that you might not have if you only do Microsoft 365 data. And some of that is not synchronized from Active Directory onwards. Or your guest accounts, for instance. If you empty out your Entra ID, then you also empty out your guests. And those are pretty hard. Well, I must admit, for some organizations, it would be a welcome purge. But for most organizations, it would be pretty painful. So yeah,
So
backup
recovery is what you're really talking about. Not just Active Directory recovery, but now you're talking more of native Entra outside of mailbox data. You're talking permissions, Entra ID applications,
Yes.
Policies, those types of settings that
Absolutely.
we as admins work with on a regular basis and make change, could make changes, introduce risk. I mean, I definitely agree with you on that one. I mean, that's a challenge a lot of organizations are facing. Obviously, that's an area that we work at from our aspect. But so any other closing words?
Well, if we're talking about backup, we can also talk about monitoring. If we talk about monitoring, we can also talk about the list goes on. I think it's a good practice to not just focus on the differences between Active Directory and Entra and all those other cloud services that you have, but also on the similarities that they might have and might need in terms of processes within your organization.
You're saying think about some of the similarities so you can build consistent processes across those environments. Is that what I heard?
Yes, and let's make it even shorter. Think.
There you go. Think. It's always a great thing.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you joining today's podcast. Obviously, it was a pleasure to have you here, and I'll be looking for new content coming out from you. And obviously, I want to learn more around the Entra governance as you're digging deeper into it. It's an area that I haven't really done a whole lot of research yet. I mean, I've done a little bit, but it sounds like you are really in it right now on this project. I'd love to hear more how that turns out in the future. But again, thanks for your time, and I look forward to having you back on one of my episodes. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.
If you like this episode of Guardians of Directory, please be sure to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. Until next time, stay guarded, stay informed, and be the guardian of your directory.